Hello, hello. So I have an interesting relationship with remote work. I started Holacracy One, my management consulting company, 17 years ago, and we started remote from the beginning. We've never had an office. We've had people all over the world working for the organization. And we created this management framework that's spread all over the world now, known as Holacracy. And this was not created for remote work. This was created to be simply a better way to run a business. And it's spread, it's all over the world now, thousands of companies using it. And then when COVID hit and remote work started becoming a really big thing, we kept hearing from our clients who had been using this management framework that thank God they got this before having to go to remote work. It made it so much easier for them to adapt both to the changing business needs and to the changing needs from the remote environment. And so we didn't really intend this to be a tool for remote work, and yet we kept getting the feedback. And of course, my own organization's been remote from the beginning. And so I found myself, since COVID, doing a lot more talks about remote work, since what we've got seems to be quite helpful for it. So let me share some of my perspectives with you here on remote work. And, first of all, I want to just call out a name. In the world today, right now, there is pushback starting, right? The remote work was this big thing some years back, and now there's more and more negatives out there about it. And I don't actually think they're all that fair. I think what's happening is remote work is exposing challenges that exist in any environment already, no matter what. And it's just the coping mechanisms we have, which are frankly not that effective anyway, don't work as well in remote environments. But we don't need better coping mechanisms if we have a better framework for work in the first place that simply works better for remote as much as it works better for in-person as well, right? And we see that the stat there is rather striking. 72% of executives said remote work makes it harder to know who owns what. But as far as I can tell, in most companies, it's already hard to know who owns what, right? I have a friend that runs a company in Amsterdam using some of the framework I'm going to share with you. And, he said what's remarkable is now that he's using this framework, he finds they were going through a fast growth phase, venture-backed company, hiring, 100 people over the course of a year. And he said what's remarkable is on people's first day of work, they can find exactly who to go to for any need or any decision, right, easily on their first day of work. And he said, that's really magic. In other fast growth environments like that he worked in, more traditionally structured ones, even in co-located environments, it would often take months of being on a job before you could reliably say, I can figure out who to go to for any need or any decision anywhere in the company easily, let alone on the first day of work. Right? I think that kind of clarity is what's needed, whether we're co-located or remote, but it's even more needed for remote work because the coping mechanisms don't work as well, right? In the office, we can compensate, right? We can survive unclear expectations. We can run into people more often. There's more natural collisions, right? There's more ability to just kind of chat and use some of the politics to get alignment. It's harder to do that when you're on Zoom, and man, it's a lot faster to get tired of meetings on Zoom than it is in person, right? So if you're using just a ton of meetings to cope for lack of clarity, which is what most organizations do, it's going to be harder remote. Right? The question isn't how do we, have just better remote work for me. The question is how do we simply improve the clarity of the organization in the first place so we don't have to use a lot of big, long, painful meetings for everything. Not to mention all the other coping mechanisms. So clarity to me is the missing link here, right? The issue isn't where people work. It's how we work together, who is accountable for what, right? If we don't know what we can expect from each other, if that's not really easy to figure out or to clarify when it's ambiguous, because often, of course, it's going to be ambiguous. Companies are evolving and changing. We need not just clarity up front. In fact, too much of that turns into bureaucracy. If you want to go try to clarify everything in your organization, you're not going to help anyone. You're going to end up with a bureaucratic mess. What we really need is an agile process to get clarity when clarity is needed, right? so that we don't need to default to all the things that we default to today. So let me give an example, a paradigm example here. Two methods of coordination that we use in cities here: stoplights versus roundabouts, right? Two different ways of controlling the flow of traffic through a system. Now, it's an interesting comparison because there's been a lot of studies on this stuff. One of these two methods consistently, people find, is more efficient. It lets more cars through per unit of time. Anyone know which of the two is more efficient? Yeah, the roundabout, far more efficient. They've done other studies on safety. One of the two methods is also quite a bit safer, less accidents per car. Yeah, roundabout as well. And yet, which one requires more of the driver? Roundabout as well, right? It's in the traffic light example. Different mic. Oh, that's much better. Thank you. In the traffic light example, you get to outsource your leadership to some third party out there. You just wait and be told what to do. You stop when you're told to stop, go when you're told to go. You don't have a burden of self-leadership. Right? There's an external authority. And yet in a roundabout, it's quite a bit different, right? You have to own and lead your part in the system. You have to coordinate with everyone else who's leading their part in the system, right? In real time, and yet it works better. It requires more of the driver, and yet it works better. Roundabouts rely on our ability to be in self-leadership. It's more efficient, it's more empowering, it's more clear, and it takes something to do. And yet, which one looks more like a traditional company today? Right? Most traditional companies look a lot more like the stoplight control system than a true distributed authority, decentralized power structure. And when you move into a remote work environment, you're in an environment that's quite a bit more like a roundabout, right? There's less ability to have signaling immediately every day. It's more expensive to have that kind of signaling. So you need to rely on people's capacity for self-leadership, much more. And to do that, you need to set them up in an environment that makes it easier for them to self-lead, right? And that starts with structure. This is one of the ironies here. Often when I'm talking to people and they want more agility and more self-leadership, more empowerment, they often move to try to get rid of structure because they think it's in the way. And it's a mistaken goal. Some structure is definitely in the way, right? But you need structure to know your power. You can have an empowering structure that tells you, here's the freedom you have. In fact, if you don't know your limits, you don't know your freedom. If you don't know what you shouldn't do without going to that Zoom meeting, then you don't know what you can do without going to that Zoom meeting. Right? If you don't know who you need to talk to when, you don't know who you don't need to talk to, and when you can just go use your judgment and lead and go fast. Right? We can't empower people. There's something ironic about that. If you need a leader who empowers you, you're in a fundamentally disempowering system. Right? If you're waiting to be told you're empowered, go, well, that's ironic, isn't it? Right? And yet what we can do is empower the system. We can empower the system with clarity and with key principles that let people step up and find and use real power and lead, right? Clarity is the most important thing we've got for that. And let me first name something about the illusion of limits, because what's in the way often of this is not real constraints, but history, habit. So if you've ever seen elephants in a traveling zoo or something like that, they're often tied on rope stakes with a wooden peg in the ground. Do you know how strong an adult elephant is? Do you know what it can do to a wooden peg and a rope? And yet they don't. They stay put, as if that's a real constraint. They could just walk away and pull it right out of the ground easily. But they don't, because when they're a baby elephant, they use a heavy iron stake driven into the ground on a metal chain around their neck. And the elephant tries to pull away, and it can't. And it learns, that's a constraint I can't overcome. So then when they grow up, they don't have to use the metal, they just use a simple rope and it stops trying. Right? When we move into a remote environment, people are used to limits. They're used to getting permissions for things. They're used to going to the meetings and getting alignment and buy-in for things. They're used to a lot of constraints that aren't necessarily real, except for the fact that they're there by habit, they're there by history, they're there by pattern, right? So remote work is going to expose that. It's going to expose all of the inefficient constraints you have that are limiting people from leading. It's going to make them more obvious and more visible and more impactful. So we need to get rid of those limits, you know? And yet, freedom requires limits. We just want the right limits, the minimally sufficient set of clear limits. They're the boundaries that define the space you have to play. There was a great study done a while back. It was one of the departments of education. I forget which one did this, but it was on a school, a kindergarten. And they had a big outdoor play space, playground, but a big field around it. And they measured how far out did the kids go and play. And then they put a fence around the perimeter of the property. The fence was only a couple feet high. It wasn't to actually keep anyone in or out, right? It just defined the space. And what happened, as soon as they put that fence, before the fence, kids clustered more towards the center of the area. As soon as that fence was in, they spread out. They filled up the available freedom because they knew their limit. Right? If you're in an environment, in a company, and don't know your limits, the tendency is to overcompensate, to assume, I don't want to use freedom I shouldn't. So I'm going to spend more time checking with people, aligning, getting buy-in, the meetings, and all that. Right? People default to a certain cautiousness, hesitation, or some people default the opposite way, if they can get away with it. That happens too. But just like those kids, as soon as you define the space, here's the space you can play in. The natural human impulse is to fill it, to use that freedom. So we need limits, but they need to be the right limits. And that means they have to be able to evolve, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So to share this, I want to give you 5 building blocks that we use in the self-management world. So Holacracy, which is my background, is an example of a self-managed system, self-management framework. There are many other ways to do this, Holacracy or otherwise, but all of the ones that I find really, really effective have kind of 5 key things in common that you can actually bring elements into in any environment, right? Because the more you enable people to be even a little more self-managed, a little more self-led, that really matters, especially in remote environments. Right? So let's talk about these 5 building blocks. The first one is about mapping out your roles and responsibilities. And by this, I don't mean writing job descriptions. Frankly, when was the last time you went and looked up something in your job description to know what to do? Right? Nobody does that. When was the last time you looked up a colleague's job description to know what you could expect of them? Right? Nobody does that. They're not real clarity. They're out of date by the time they're off the printer. They're somebody's theoretical idea of clarity. And they tend to be quite big, right? 1 job description per person. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about mapping out the actual functions that are needed to get the work done. And when you do it this way, each role is a small function. A single person might fill 10 or 20 roles, right? Just like in real life. I fill a role at home sometimes of dishwasher, right? It's not the sum total of my job in my house, but it's 1 role I fill, loading up the dishwasher, right? I fill many little roles in life. You can do the same, map out these roles, right? And not just vague job descriptions. You want the minimally sufficient clarity, no more. You're not trying to document everything. You're trying to get just a skeletal structure or framework that clarifies what are the roles that we need and who fills which. And this is an example of the software tool Glassfrog here, which is a tool for mapping this out. And you can see each role has 3 elements: a purpose, which gives you the why. This is really important, especially in remote teams, when you want people to be creative and go beyond just kind of doing their job, but to actually use their creativity. They need to know why. Why does the role exist? What's the ultimate goal? What's success look like? So give it a purpose. And then we have domains, right? Domains here tell you what is this role's to control? What is the property of this role? Right? So in this case, we have a business manager role that has a property of the Glassfrog business model. What that's doing is telling everyone else on the team, if you want to change to the Glassfrog business model, you don't need to bring it to a meeting. You don't need to go run it up the management chain. The person who fills this role has the authority to control the business model. Right? It's really clear who controls what. And it tells everyone else, don't do anything that's going to impact the business model unless you check in with this role and make sure you're not going to cause any harm. And then there's the accountabilities, which tell you what are the activities we can expect of this role. And you don't, again, need to clarify all of them. If things are just working smoothly, you don't need to document it. Document when tension presents itself, when you run into ambiguity that slows you down, when it's not clear who does something and that gets in the way. There you have an opportunity not just to solve it, but to figure out What do we expect of each other so this slowdown, this issue, never gets in the way again, never slows us down again? What expectation do we need to clarify on which role so that we know how to lead going forward without having to default to a meeting? This kind of clarity maximizes the amount of meetings you don't need to have, right? Or in other words, minimizes the amount of time you need to go try to get alignment and buy-in. You know who does what, you know who controls what, and you know why. When you've got that kind of clarity, right, and it's dynamic, we'll come back to that. It's got to be a living document or this gets out of date just like job descriptions do. Right? But when it's a living document that's capturing the team's learning, here's what we need to expect of each other. People will reference it. They will look it up. They will use it. We see this in companies running with this framework all the time because it's real clarity. It's the team capturing its learning, right? And it saves a lot of time in meetings. And when you have these clear roles, you can then map out, all right, how do we do the meta things we need to do together, like prioritize? How do we influence each other? When we need to request something from someone, what can we expect from them, right? And what can we expect them to do in terms of give us transparency into how they're tracking what we're requesting, right? You can map out these rules and expectations, and there's examples of what you might want to have for these in Glassfrog if you want to look at that. Or at holacracy.org if you want to look at some of the ones built into Holacracy. There's literally a written constitution that defines, here are the things that you can expect from one another so that you don't need to go to the meeting or the manager. You know exactly how the working flow is going to happen between people. What can you expect of somebody because of the roles they fill? Right? You can establish norms and agreements. All this stuff needs to be clear. And I don't mean just talking it out all the time. Talk it out when you run into an issue, sure, and then clarify it so you never need to have that conversation again. Then, of course, you're going to need some meetings, and man, they need to be better than most meetings if you're going to be in a remote environment over Zoom. I don't know about you all, but I get tired of Zoom 10 times faster. And it's hard to stay present in Zoom for a long period of time, so your meetings better be efficient. And there's a whole meeting process and agenda. You can find that little process card has, you can download that on our website at holacracy.org. It's also built into Glassfrog at glassfrog.com. But there's a meeting process here that's really useful. And I'll just highlight a couple of shifts that you can apply tomorrow to make your meetings better. One, we don't have agendas built in advance of the meeting. We have a meeting framework. We know the steps we're going to go through in the meeting, roughly, every meeting. But then when it comes to the specific agenda items, we build it in the meeting on the fly, based on the real tensions that are surfaced. When you build meetings in advance, people tend to put things on the meeting because they think they should put things on that meeting agenda. Or they put what looks good, or what they think they should update on. It gets very heady and theoretical. When you build it on the fly in the meeting, you're asking people to sense tensions in their body, in their hearts. You're asking them to say, what's in the way of you doing your work? And add that agenda item. And when we get into that agenda item, it's going to be owned by the person who raised it. The goal is not to talk about that issue. This is not an agenda of topics to discuss. It's an agenda of tensions to process. And when you've added an item to the agenda and we get to your agenda item, we're going to say, what do you need? And it's up to you to make whatever requests you want and to lead the resolution of that agenda item as fast as possible. No one else is going to bring their stuff into it. They're going to add their own agenda items if they want something. Right? They're there in a support role for you. What do you need? How can I help? Right? And however many items you have on the agenda, divide that, or take the meeting time, divide it by the number of items. That's how long you've got per meeting, the goal, or per agenda item. The goal is to finish every item on the agenda in the time you've got. And you're going to move as fast as you need to do that. It's a rapid-fire, fast-paced process. Harvard Business School did a couple of studies on companies running with this meeting structure and this whole framework. One of the things one of the companies found was the average time it took in a meeting to get to a clear action or decision from someone else when you needed it, using this meeting structure and principles, was about 90% less after 6 months of doing this than before. It means you can get 10 times as much done in the meeting time or have 1/10 the meeting time for the same result. Right? There's more to this meeting process, but those are some of the key highlights. Agendas built on the fly, tensions to process, not topics to discuss. All that matters for each agenda item is whoever raised the agenda item says, I got what I need, and it's done. If anyone else needs something, they add their own agenda item. Take turns, one person at a time. What do you need? What do you need? get it done, move. Right? Then, from there, shift the culture. Most companies today have what I call a restrictive culture. The operating norm in most company cultures is don't do anything you don't already normally do without permission. And you get permission either by running it up a management hierarchy or more likely calling a big meeting, socializing it, and making sure everybody's aligned and in agreement. It's incredibly inefficient, right? In a restrictive culture, the felt sense is, ooh, I better be careful and not step on toes and check in and make sure everything's okay before I do something new. But you can shift that to this stance. When you fill a role, we have clarity now. We have domains telling you what not to mess with without checking with other people. So when you have a role and you have a purpose to meet or an accountability to get done, you have the authority to take any action anywhere in the company or make any decision you want as long as there's not a rule against it. So the default now is permissive. This is a permissive culture. The default is use your judgment and lead. You can make any decision you want unless there's a rule against it. And now we'll focus on getting the minimally sufficient constraints to keep everything safe. The domains we need, the policies we need, whatever we need to limit that freedom. But the default is, unless there's a rule against it, you don't need buy-in, you don't need consensus, you don't need the manager. Go lead your role. Be the CEO of your roles. Lead. And if somebody else feels tension about that, well, great, we're going to learn from that. That will help us clarify what other constraints do we need to put in place. Right? That enables real autonomy. Makes everyone a leader. And finally, to keep this working, you need a way to evolve the structure. The roles, the domains, the policies, all of that stuff. And you can do that via any number of processes. It can be as simple as the manager is just going to update the roles and policies. But there are also more inclusive processes that are quite useful for this. I had a case in one of the companies I run many years ago. I do a lot of conference speaking like this, and we have another role called casting agent that books me for talks. And the woman filling that role had some tension because sometimes she'd negotiate with a conference organizer, build a whole relationship, make a plan, and at the end of that process, I'd shoot it down and say, I'm not going to go, it's the wrong market or not big enough or whatever. And that was kind of disempowering. So she went to our governance process and said, I propose we add an expectation onto your spokesperson role, which is the role I'm filling right now, add an expectation onto the spokesperson role for documenting the criteria you're going to use to accept or reject speaking engagements and then sticking to it. It became an accountability on my role. It was done in a facilitated governance meeting process for the marketing team both our roles exist in. It took 2 minutes. 2 minutes later, she was able to turn to me and say, so, when do you think you'll have a draft of that for me? The interesting footnote, I'm the founder of the company and a seasoned CEO for many years, and she was our newest hire right out of college. In what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can add an expectation onto the founder and then turn to him and say, when will you have that done for me by? Right? That's a culture that promotes agility. It's not personal. It's about clarifying the roles in the working structure so we can move fast. We can cut out the waste, cut out the inefficiency, and move. I'm sure you can imagine what that does in even an in-person team, but let alone a remote team where that kind of speed and agility is even more important. Right? And notice it's all driven by real tensions. Right? That happened because she sensed something that could be better than it was that was in the way of her work, and she brought a proposal, and she adapted the structure, and now I started doing that, and everything got more efficient after that. All right. So, if you want to do this, you want to do it at scale, you can. This scales very well. You can have teams with roles, and those roles can be broken down further into sub-roles. You know, your marketing team is basically a marketing role, can have social media team, an advertising team, and all these, and each of those can get broken down. It's a fractal structure, scales well. You have roles at every layer, right? Every layer can have this clarity. Every team can have that process where anybody can propose a change to the roles and policies on that team, which enables everyone in the company to actually help sense, how does this get more efficient, more effective? How do we remove the constraints to flow? And the right tools will really help. You're going to want a tool to capture all this. You need to be able to visualize the structure, easily find roles, right? You need to see operationally what projects is each role owning, that kind of thing. There are many platforms that do this well. Glassfrog is one of them that my company makes, but again, you don't need to use our software, just something that makes all this visual and easy to change. You want anyone to be able to use it to propose a change to the structure, right? To request projects and actions from each other, to have meetings that are streamlined and efficient in there, all that kind of stuff is built into the tool. And you can find a lot more at glassfrog.com about that if you want to see what a tool looks like. Holacracy.org will share more about the general process and framework that I just covered. More resources, lots of free resources on both websites, so check that out. And let's do a question or two if we have time. Yeah, thank you.